Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Kyle Wilson, and I'm a classroom teacher by trade. I have spent the better part of the last 2 decades in middle school classrooms teaching English language arts, social studies, and most recently, mathematics. Ever since I was a young boy, I've had an unhealthy obsession with learning as much about the world around me as possible. This has been both a blessing and a burden in my life. My love of learning is the primary reason why I am a well-rounded and mildly successful adult. However, it is also the reason why I don't have very many friends. I have been told many times in my life that I am a bit of an insufferable know-it-all. So, I stand before you this evening, lifelong learner, professional know-it-all, to tell you that I kind of hate school. Strange thing for a teacher to be saying, I know. To be more specific, I don't really hate school per se, but I hate what it has become in contrast to what it could and should be. For years, I have been relentlessly searching for the cause of my disdain for the institution that I have dedicated the bulk of my personal and professional life to. I believe I have finally found the source of my frustration: academic standards. So tonight, I will ask and hopefully answer the question, what if we abolished academic standards from the American education system? For the uninitiated to the minutia of our current K-12 system, the entire enterprise is predicated upon and built around a set of academic standards for every grade level. They look like this. So, academic standards as they currently exist are considered gospel at every single level of our current system. So, proposing to, every single discussion about student achievement at the legislative, cultural, and school levels are all centered around academic standards. So proposing to eliminate them is a lot like asking Christians to forget about the New Testament. This may seem a bit hyperbolic to some of you, but these so-called standards are at the root of how and why American schools are what they are and why they are failing en masse. Now, why would I make such a controversial claim that goes against the current collective conventional wisdom? To answer that question, I prefer to answer another. How did we get here? For the sake of time, I'll begin that story in 1983 with an infamous A Nation at Risk report, which essentially outlined how by the early 1980s, the American education system was quickly falling behind the rest of the developed world. James J. Harvey, the primary author of that study, famously stated that if an unfriendly foreign power had imposed upon America the current mediocre academic performance of today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. Ouch. In response to this dire news, we spent the next couple of decades scrambling to course correct our failing schools, and a bunch of different ideas were bandied about, and by the early 2000s, we mostly settled on a path forward. We decided to implement high standards and to test students on those standards and see if they met them. Simple, straightforward, and theoretically effective. The driving philosophy behind this standards-based reform movement was accountability. Having high standards would only be meaningful if teachers and students were tested on them and then faced consequences for how they did. So, did it work? The short answer is, not at all. To illustrate the efficacy of the standards-based model of education, I like to look at one of the gold standard examples of this policy in action. The state I was educated in, Massachusetts. Massachusetts is often considered one of the best, if not the best, state education systems in America. In 1993, Massachusetts passed the Education Reform Act, and they implemented a high-stakes, high-standards, standardized testing system. Although there were a few bumps in the road, by the early 2000s, the average Massachusetts students' reading and math scores were up, And many in the education world dubbed this rise in scores as part of the Massachusetts miracle. The combination of high standards and high stakes was considered a resounding success, and many other states began to follow suit. So naturally, as promised by standards-based reformers, we saw the achievement gap between socioeconomically disadvantaged students and their wealthier peers start to shrink, and the racial achievement gap must have started to close as well, right? Despite all this talk of miracles, we now know today that the socioeconomic achievement gap and racial achievement gap in Massachusetts have actually increased since the 1990s. So effectively, all these standards-based reforms accomplished was to slightly increase the average test scores of wealthier students and did relatively nothing for more disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged students. I will certainly grant that this is a gross oversimplification of an incredibly complex, nuanced issue. But it really is that simple. We have been aggressively implementing the standards-based model of education for over 30 years, and all we have to show for it is 36% of American 12th graders scoring proficient in reading, 26% in math, and 21% in science. Even more depressing than that, the adult literacy rate in America is only 79%, ranked 36th in the world, 7% below the global average. In addition, approximately 55% of American adults read below the 6th grade level. The most tragic part of all this mess is that the American education system was supposed to be a great equalizer, but today it is the primary driver of an increasingly rigid socioeconomic caste system that determines the quality of your education and your opportunities based on your zip code and your wealth. For years, educators, parents, and students have been sounding the alarm on the harms of standardized testing, and for very good reasons. However, I believe that only looking at standardized testing as the problem is just us trying to treat the symptoms and not the disease, the standards. I think a lot of people forget that standardized testing would have never reached the current prevalence that we see today without a standards-centered education model. To me, it's a lot like we planned a dream road trip, where we spent all of our time mapping out all the beautiful, incredible places we wanted our kids to visit, but we never made it out of the driveway because we didn't realize the RV didn't even have an engine. And for 30+ years, leaders in education have been sitting in the driver's seat telling us, don't worry, we'll get moving any day now. Rigorous or high standards have never been and never will be what promotes meaningful learning. It is true that if you give kids rigorous and meaningful work to do, they will rise to the occasion more often than not. But just assuming that setting the high bar is what drives meaningful learning is a tragic case and confusing causation with correlation. After decades of research, we know that engagement is what drives meaningful learning. We also know that engagement is heavily impacted by how students feel about what they are learning. True meaningful learning is driven by curiosity, passion, relevance, and authenticity. Standardized learning opportunities provide very little curiosity, passion, relevance, and authenticity for most kids. When we look at the aggregate of polling data around student engagement in school, we find that about 75 to 80% of elementary school students feel engaged in school. But only 45 to 50% of middle school students feel engaged in school. And only about 25 to 30% of high school students feel engaged in school. Interestingly, there's a strong correlation between the drop in engagement that we see between elementary and high school and a drop in proficiency that we see between elementary and high school. As engagement drops over the years, proficiency begins dropping at a similar rate. It is my belief that we systematically standardize a love of learning and proficiency itself out of children. Standardized school just kind of sucks. Kids definitely know it, and I think most parents and educators know it too. But we don't want to say it out loud, because for better or worse, we know that education is the gateway to opportunity. So we push our kids through, support them as best we can, and just pray that it works out. So the question now becomes, what do? Well, if I were in charge of the entire enterprise, my first act would be to abolish the entirety of the state's standards and standardized testing apparatus. Now, I can already hear the protests from many parents and many of my fellow educators. If there are no standards, Mr. Know-it-all, what will the children learn? No! What will we teach them? My argument is not that the content of most academic standards shouldn't be taught, but rather they are redundant and already exist outside of the state standards model. Every single grade level and course that exists today has a detailed outline of all of the skills and topics that will be taught. We call this scope and sequence. What I am proposing is that instead of placing what students learn at the top of the educational hierarchy, that we place how students learn at the top of that hierarchy by emphasizing engagement. We can create the most perfect lesson plans, make the learning truly authentic and meaningful, but if kids aren't willing to engage, all of it means absolutely nothing. So how we engage students in the classroom and how teachers can effectively deliver content through engagement needs to be where we devote the overwhelming majority of our time and resources. Academic research over the last few decades has also given us two essential facts that should be forcing us to reimagine how we do school. First, engagement is what drives meaningful learning. And second, the single most impactful element of any child's education is their classroom teachers. Sadly, this leads me to some more bad news. I believe that our current standards-based education model is also the primary driver of the current teaching crisis. If you pay attention to local or national headlines, you probably already know that the teaching profession is in a bit of a pickle. Teacher turnover rates are at all-time highs. Shortages are rampant in over half of US states. Teacher turnover rates are exponentially higher in school districts that serve our most disadvantaged students, and highly qualified teachers are becoming hyper-concentrated in wealthy school districts. Student apathy, student resentment, and teacher turnover are not bugs in the system, they are the designed outcome. So not only are the standards squeezing proficiency out of our kids, they are suffocating the heart and soul of the entire enterprise. We have created an education system where a large proportion of students hate being in that system. So who in their right mind wants to spend all of their time teaching students who resent them for the system that they represent? We need to meet kids where they are and tailor their educational experiences to their specific needs, strengths, and weaknesses. What we are currently doing is dragging them kicking and screaming towards a dream and a vision crafted by a group of faceless academics and legislatures who know nothing about them. Every single child in America deserves an individualized learning program carefully crafted by their teachers, their parents, and themselves. The standards-based model of education has failed, and by James J. Harvey's standards, we are waging war upon ourselves by allowing it to continue. To close, let me finally answer my initial question. What if we abolished academic standards? I believe that most things in our education system would get better, as long as we replace the current standards-based model with an engagement-based model, a lot like one you heard about earlier tonight from my colleague Megan Denkenberger, Universal Design. Academic standards already exist within the scope and sequence models, kindergarten through 12th grade. When they serve as the foundation for educating kids, they're just redundant and harmful. Now, I know optimism wasn't exactly a core feature of my talk tonight. And for that, I apologize. But I would like to close on an optimistic note, because I do believe that we are headed for a watershed moment in education, because the current system is not sustainable at all. I think deep down, we all know this. And if we can collectively tap into that deep sense of frustration, I do believe that we could quickly and easily transform our education system. The infrastructure is already here. All we need to do is stop capitulating to the status quo. So I would like to close with a few more what ifs. What if we stop accepting mediocrity for our children? Woo. What if parents, students, and educators take collective action to push for something new? What if we stop allowing people who know absolutely nothing about education to make the decisions on how we educate our kids? What if we stop compromising and start building something better? Thank you.